Hey, everybody. Time for another one of my lectures. As you know from looking at the syllabus, this lecture is going to deal with the U.S. history documents that you were assigned to read. And some of them I know that at least some of you are familiar with. I know we have some international students who might not be as familiar with some of the U.S. history documents as other students. So I'm going to go over them, try and point out some highlights, especially in relation to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and then get a little more in detail with the sort of debates between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, which had to do with what kind of a constitution this country would in fact have, what would be the different parts of it, and how would it shape the kind of government that we would have and the kind of nation that we would have. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about Frederick Douglass' famous 5th of July speech, which was actually given on the 4th of July. But as you could tell, there was a reason that that was changed in Douglas's speech. Then a piece by Harriet Martineau on called The Political Non-Existence of Women. And I'll sort of kind of draw some parallels and some contrasts between Douglas and Martineau. As I know I've mentioned multiple times before, many of the people who worked for women's rights and suffrage also were abolitionists and vice versa. And then I will finish up talking a little bit about the Iroquois Constitution, at least the document that we now have that's called the Iroquois Constitution. There are lots of questions about how authentic it is, et cetera. Where did it exactly come from? And I'll get into those a little bit as well. But it's an intriguing document, especially when you compare and contrast it with the U.S. Constitution. So first, basically, some things about the Declaration and the Constitution. You remember that I've said multiple times that the perspective of the founders often was what we would call today deist, right? These are people who believed in some kind of a higher being. They didn't necessarily subscribe to a particular religion. I had mentioned that Thomas Jefferson actually made his own deist version of the Bible by cutting out certain segments of the Bible that he didn't like, etc. I believe that document exists currently at the University of Virginia, which makes sense since that was the school that Thomas Jefferson started, the first public university in the world, I believe. So they were deists. There is obviously a reference to God in the Declaration of Independence, which we know Thomas Jefferson was the main author for. And it's really sort of an appeal for kind of the God-given rights and freedoms, right, that everybody should have. It's to help kind of sanction that claim for those rights. So as we know, one line reads, endowed by their creator, right, with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Again, those come from Locke, though Jefferson changed the word property, changed Locke's life, liberty, and property to life, liberty, and happiness. I think a significant part because of his reading in Aristotle. I know I've mentioned that as well. But no reference to God in the Constitution, which was actually a point of contention. As we'll see, the Anti-Federalists, who tended to be more the voice of the artisans and kind of small single-family farmers, closer to the land, you might say directly, tended to want to maintain some language about God in the Constitution. The Federalists did not want to do so. So I'll get into that a little bit. And as I know, I've also talked about, there was in an earlier draft of the Declaration of Independence language about the evils of slavery that was eventually removed. I think it was put in the Declaration, and I'm sure Jefferson played a role here, basically knowing that it was going to be controversial and would probably be removed, but wanting to at least remind everybody of that institution, and that institution does seem to be in conflict with the larger classical liberal philosophy about rights and freedoms for all people. The Constitution, when you read it, one of the things you really notice is it wasn't really fleshed out. It needs to be fleshed out over time, right? It was an experimental document in a sense. I know a lot of people would like to believe that the founders somehow were given the great genius to be able to write this incredible non-historical document that can stand for all times and all peoples, et cetera, and that it came out, as it were, in its final form, just as it should be, and that we shouldn't be changing it over time, et cetera, except perhaps making some amendments. But certainly, it was just a framework. There were a lot of things that people needed to kind of figure out about how to make things work. What were the individual policies going to be, and different laws that would fall within the Constitution that would be consistent with it. And it took quite a while for that to really, take shape. And you can still see during the Civil War era questions being asked about the Constitution, and pretty basic questions, we would say today, about what's constitutional and what's not constitutional. And as we know, in the last several years, there's been more discussion and debate about that. For example, most recently about impeachment, right? Impeaching presidents. Can you impeach somebody who's already out of office? Can you carry through with that process if the impeachment began when they were still in office? Those are interesting questions, I think, right? And we've seen constitutional scholars weigh in recently in the case of Donald Trump and his impeachment about that. One thing I want to talk just a little briefly about here is education. As some of you know, my main teaching assignment is in the School of Education. One of the fascinating things about education in this country is that most of the responsibility and the authority in education for public education is given to the states. And of course, they kind of share that power with the local, governments, local communities, right? And this functioned in this form for quite a while. Over time, we gradually moved from giving most of the power to individual districts, which at the time, remember, were going to be, for the most part, relatively small communities, farming communities, right? Some of them relative in isolation from other communities, right? We didn't have the same kind of transportation system and communication that we had as we move forward in time. So things were more localized on an individual basis, right? And a very Jeffersonian sort of what came to be known as a form of agrarian republicanism. Where the, sort of the main voice for what would happen in your community would be the people who were living in that community. That came to schools as well. As we move forward and we get into the Industrial Revolution, we get into urbanization, we get into the growth of cities, more immigration coming into the country, people see more of a demand to have more state control of education. And again, that is pretty consistent with the Constitution. So we had the first public schools, right? Formal public schools, systems of education. They first formed not in Virginia, where Jefferson made that attempt previously, but in Massachusetts because of, in particular, urbanization. Again, immigrants coming into Boston, in particular Irish Protestants, Irish Catholics coming in when there were already Irish Protestants there, conflicts between those groups. So it was thought that you could unite the people, you could come up with a common set of morals and values that people would agree with. You could get kids off the streets by making education compulsory, so they would have to go to school, give them some, assimilate them into the American way of life, as it were. And so more state control there. There was some controversy because many people believed that, in particular, the person most responsible for this, who was the Secretary of Education in Massachusetts, a guy named Horace Mann, who had formerly been an attorney, instituted what today we would call the Protestant work ethic and really promoted it. Now, he was only the secretary of the Board of Education, so he was not in a policy-making position, but he wrote up these yearly school reports and published pamphlets and things about what different schools in different areas of Massachusetts were doing. And in doing so, he was actually able to leverage change, right? Especially kind of competition within the different districts to have a better education system than other districts. He pointed out, for example, that female teachers could be paid less than male teachers. He didn't necessarily like this, but female teachers tended to be paid only a third of what male teachers were. Still today, we don't have equity in, as we know, in salaries sort of across the board in this country, but definitely within education. We also have what is kind of weakening, but used to be a pretty strong dichotomy with females teaching the younger grades, males teaching the older grades, all those kinds of things. And again, this Protestant work ethic. And people believe that Horace Mann was more interested in appeasing kind of business owners, people who owned, factories and managers of factories, and assimilating these immigrants into this Protestant work ethic, that they were actually creating these docile, ready to go workers, right, who would show up on time to work and all these other kinds of things that we identify with the Protestant work ethic, right? So there was some controversy along those lines. As we get into the 20th century, in particular into the Cold War in this country, right? Late 1940s into the 1950s, people believe there's more demand for more federal control, more national control of education, because of the threat of the Cold War, the threat of the Soviet Union in particular. This was eventually then, after the Cold War, as the Cold War started to ease, turned into competition with Japan and some other countries economically, especially as we get into the electronics industries, more high-tech industries, and the real belief that our education system needs to maintain the focus on math and science that came during the Cold War and kind of roll it over, less from a Cold War perspective in the development of weaponry and so on, to having the kind of graduates who could take jobs in these technology industries of various kinds, right, as engineers, etc. However, because the Constitution gives the main control of education to the states, the federal government could not directly create policy and impose it on the schools and on the states. It still can't do that. We know there have been a number of education reforms after those in the Cold War that, again, really started to push for math and science, which, of course, really benefited boys and men rather than girls and women, since at the time it was believed that boys and men were much more competent in mathematics and science than females were. So it did create a major gender bias that we're still trying to deal with again in our education system. And at the same time, really, other kinds of things led to the development of other federal or national government education initiatives. And again, I'm calling them initiatives because they weren't really direct policies that could be imposed on the schools. However, the federal government does control a lot of money that the states and districts need for their education systems. And that has been the way it has been able to leverage change in school reform with things like No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top of the Obama administration, other educational initiatives that started in the 1980s after a report was done called A Nation at Risk, which showed how at risk our country was economically, politically, militarily, with our failing schools, et cetera. It basically said the country was unilaterally disarming itself educationally, and that we were going to be directly threatened by the Soviet Union, these other countries who are rapidly developing their technology industries, et cetera. So these reforms were reforms basically where the federal government said, we know that there's money you need from the federal government to run your schools. Education becomes increasingly expensive over time, especially with increasing diversity. If you want this money, here's some things you will do in terms of what you teach, and especially in terms of assessment, right? Tests that you would need to give to show that your schools were performing adequately, that your students were performing adequately, et cetera. That created all kinds of controversy. We still struggle in this country because we have this really disjointed education system where there are separate kinds of power coming from the local school district and the state and the federal government. I'm sure a lot of you as students got caught sort of within that. You may even had teachers talking about the fact that, the things that they would like to do, the local district would like them to do, but they can't because the state has other things it would like them to do or other tests they have to give. And then the state has to deal with what the federal government also wants, if it wants these education funds the federal government provides. So again, it's really important that in our Constitution, control of education was given to the states. Look at a lot of other countries with very successful school systems. They tend to be more centralized. They tend to have national control of their schools, national curriculum, national testing. They can make changes more quickly in their education systems, et cetera. We're in a very different situation in this country, and I think it's important for people to realize that. Okay, so we get to the Constitution. A lot of controversy as to what the Constitution would be like, how strong a central government we would have in particular. And this led to these debates, essentially for ratification of the Constitution. And so there were papers written largely under pseudonyms. They were circulated among the public and presenting sort of arguments for and against a strong central government. So you had the Anti-Federalist group, which I'll talk about, and the Federalist group. The Anti-Federalists wanting a weaker central government, the Federalist group wanting a stronger central government. And in fact, some of the Anti-Federalists actually wanted to maintain what we were already working with as sort of a new nation trying to find itself under what were called the Articles of Confederation, right? They were begun in 1776 and were finished in 1777. Essentially, the Revolutionary War was fought under the Articles of Confederation. They were ratified in 1781. And some of the Anti-Federalists thought that they could be tweaked a little bit and that we could still use those, that we didn't have to develop an all-new constitution. They liked the fact that the Articles of Confederation did not provide a strong central government, right? A confederation of states, right? So you did have a group that was in some ways functioning as a whole, but that also gave a lot of individual rights to the individual states. And again, ratifying the Constitution was about ratifying it, by the states. In theory, with the Constitution, had certain states not ratified it, they could have become separate countries. That didn't happen. As we know, there's still sometimes calls for different states within them that they feel like they would like to become their own country. They would like to become independent, etc. So the Federals really pushed for this new Constitution. Again, some of the Anti-Federalists want to maintain the Articles of Confederation. I think they eventually realized that that idea wasn't going to work, but they wanted this new confederation, a new Constitution, to be like the Articles of Confederation in providing lots of states' rights. And that states' rights sort of terminology should sort of remind you that, or sort of resonate with you with the Civil War, right? Because during the Civil War, the South was working with a constitution that it had developed that for a confederacy, right? So you had the Confederacy in the South. We had the Articles of Confederation that were utilized during the Revolutionary War. It was a challenge for the South in particular to fight the Civil War because it was trying to fight that war as a confederacy of states without having the same kind of strong central power that the North was able to have under the Constitution. For example, the individual states in the South could only make certain kinds of demands. Excuse me, the government in the South, the government of the Confederacy, so it could demand that troops be sent up from the different states or certain kind of resources provided and that sort of thing, but it did not have the authority and power under Jefferson Davis and the Confederacy that Lincoln had in the North. And Lincoln even struggled himself to get the northern states to provide troops sometimes and other kinds of resources to fight the war, et cetera. But it was a bigger issue in the South because in some sense, the Confederacy, as was operating in the South, was antithetical to what the Confederacy was fighting for, which was for a relatively weak set of Confederate states, right? But they kind of realized that to actually fight this war, they had to kind of go against that idea a little bit and have more of a stronger central government, again, under Jefferson Davis. So interesting dynamic there. One of the Federalists, one of the most famous Federalists was George Washington, who experienced the opposite. He experienced during the Revolutionary War trying to fight against the English with just a group of colonies under the Articles of Confederation. He had a very difficult time pulling together, right, the Continental Army because he didn't have the authority to really demand that the colonies provide so many troops and food and other resources. And that's why that army struggled so much for food and shelter and munitions and other kinds of things. Because Jefferson did not have that authority and that power to really make any kind of demands on what the colonies would provide him to fight against the English. So Washington was a Federalist. He really wanted to have a strong central government for issues like having a military, being able to fight wars, etc. Another person who was on the Federalist side for related reasons was Ben Franklin. Some of you know during much of the Revolutionary War, Ben Franklin was in Paris in France, working with the French, gradually using his diplomatic skills to try to convince the French to come in on the side of the revolutionaries, on the side of the American revolutionaries, against the English, because he knew, for example, that they were enemies of the English, right? For a long time, France and England were enemies and had many conflicts over time historically. But wanting them to come in on the side of the revolutionaries to help them fight against the English. And so for foreign policy reasons, Ben Franklin wanted to have the authority to be able to speak for the colonies with a unified voice that he didn't really have. And a lot of that foreign policy that he was trying to negotiate took a lot of time, because for decisions to be made, et cetera, you had to sail back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean, which was not just dangerous, it took a long time, et cetera. And was very difficult, very challenging. The French, as some of you know, historically did decide to come in on the side of the revolutionaries and assist, and did assist in some ways pretty considerably, especially the French Navy. That was in the second half of the Revolutionary War. So for foreign policy reasons, Franklin also wanted to have a relatively strong central government. So you can see that some of these calls for both a weak central government and the Anti-Federalist and a strong central government from the Federalist did have roots in historical events and what were recent historical events in terms of what the different sides were really arguing for. So I just wanted to make sure to emphasize that. Other Federalists whose names you will recognize would be James Madison, right, who we identify with the Constitution, like we identify Jefferson with the Declaration. Alexander Hamilton, of course, who was always very interested in banking and money and currency and those kinds of things. Also John Adams and John Jay. They were also kind of on the Federalists' side. Again, wanted to have a relatively strong central government. So I'm just going to show you two things quickly here that will provide you with some comparisons between the two groups that I hope you find helpful here. And I'll just pop these up. So this is obviously a kind of comparison, right? So the Anti-Federalists wanted to have more representatives in government in terms of representatives from, in particular from the states. The Federalists wanted to have fewer representatives. They wanted to have equal numbers of representatives for the states. So again, we ended up with having both, right? We have a House of Representatives and we have a Senate. And that ultimately goes back to this argument for fewer or greater number of representatives and whether or not they should be proportional. Obviously, states that had smaller populations were worried that if you just went with proportional representation, they would have less power, whereas states that were larger and had more people thought they maybe should have more power, and so the states should have equal representatives, so that the states with smaller populations wouldn't have as much power as they did. Again, weaker central government, stronger states' rights on the Anti-Federalist side, strong central government, a weaker state government on the Federalist side. Again, as I mentioned, the Anti-Federalists were mostly made up of small farmers, shopkeepers, and laborers, so working class, middle class. Whereas on the Federalist side, you had wealthier people, mostly property owners, people who owned plantations, people who owned some of these larger trading companies. Right? They were very interested in trade, especially international trade. They wanted to have a stronger central government to help with issues of trade and trade policy and taxing, right? The controlling of taxes, in particular of foreign products that people in this country might want to buy, to make sure that they were a lot cheaper than products being made in this country, right? By adding taxes to them, et cetera. And again, they wanted a stronger central government to be able to do that. Anti-federalists believed in democracy and giving all people a voice, educated or not. So again, you can see that how it would fit in more with small farmers, shopkeepers, et cetera, laborers who were likely to be less educated than would people who were plantation owners and involved in international trade. Federalist side, more focus on the educated. People should make decisions, right? The common man can't be trusted to make a smart choice. That idea, it didn't predominate, but it was an increasing concern, especially as industrialization increased over time, especially as immigration increased and more diversity in immigration. As life becomes more complicated, this classical liberal idea that the common man is the ideal citizen and should be able to decide his own life, local government, have a voice in state government, et cetera, regardless of level of education and other kinds of things. People start becoming concerned about that idea, that life was becoming more complicated. You needed to have educated, experienced people, especially at higher levels of government, and even, again, at state and local levels eventually. And this idea of the common man potentially being able to rise up from being born a laborer to being president of the United States starts to really fade as something that's really realistic. Jefferson at least liked to hold that out as a possibility. And you can see that in the education system that he tried to develop for Virginia, which again was not put into practice. His education system would give scholarships to students, male students, beyond the elementary level. If you were the best elementary student, if you were a male in your elementary school, you could get a scholarship to move up to the next level of education, which was grammar school, which is kind of like middle school, high school as we think of it today, and eventually to a university education. I think people realized there was not much likelihood that would happen, but it was important symbolically, right? That you could be born as poor as dirt, as they say, and become president of the United States. And that's still sort of an important idea today, I think, in theory, even though the vast majority of people, I think, believe that that's not possible, that that would never happen. That's the idea of a natural aristocracy where you acquire wealth and power and education through talent and virtue, versus old Europe and its monarchy and aristocracy, where it was, family connections and wealth that provide you with power and education and entry into politics, et cetera. And I think it's really important for people in this nation to maintain sort of that idea of natural aristocracy, right? And at least want to hold out in theory that you could, work your way up. I think you've even seen that a little bit in the appeal that President Biden tried to make to a lot of working class folks, that that's his background too. He's not Ivy League educated, right? That he went to a local school and achieved what he did. I think also with the vice president, Kamala Harris, and Howard University being an institution that's been historically Black college, and being able to achieve what she was able to achieve eventually. You saw those things, I think, mentioned a lot because it was believed those would appeal to a lot of obviously African Americans and working class people, that they didn't go to elite Ivy League schools, that they got into just because their parents went to those same schools, right? What are often called legacy candidates when it comes to admission to colleges and to universities. I have one other kind of comparison of the Federalists and Anti-Federalists that all it'll cover some of the same issues, but also some things that weren't covered in the previous slide. So I'll go over theirs with you. So again, Federalists, Anti-Federalists are actually sort of pictures of them here. On the Federalist side, and again, you see both wrote a collection of essays to support the Constitution on the Federalist side, criticizing the Constitution on the Anti-Federalist side. The Federalists wanting a new constitution that they believed would solve the problems of the Articles of Confederation. With the Anti-Federalists, there was this sort of opposition to slavery. Again, the Federalists were really the plantation owners who might want to maintain slavery, excuse me. The Anti-Federalists more likely to be opposed to slavery. And questions, of course, about whether it would continue to exist under the new Constitution. And we know that it did, in fact, continue to exist. It was actually, three men that really wrote most of the essays on the side of the Federals, again, under pseudonyms: Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. On the Anti-Federalist side, Patrick Henry, Giving Me Liberty, Give Me Death, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Richard Henry Lee, who was the same family that Robert E. Lee would come from and fighting in the Confederacy, and also George Mason. They were worried that too strong a central federal government would really trample on people's rights. Their number one opposition was that there was no Bill of Rights. They wanted to have those rights specifically laid out in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights to maintain people's individual freedoms and also freedoms at the local level and at the state level. And as we know, that was one of the things that the Federalists eventually sort of gave into and agreed to a Bill of Rights to get this thing ratified, right? And I think the vast majority of people today would say that that was a good thing, that this Bill of Rights. You'll notice that Thomas Jefferson's name is not mentioned here. Thomas Jefferson's basic political outlook did provide a lot of arguments for the Anti-Federalists because he was somebody that really believed in smaller government. Again, famous for saying he'd rather live in a country that had newspapers and no government than the opposite. He really believed literacy, education, information, the sharing of information through pamphlets and newspapers and publications, self-education, self-reliance, that those things were important, right? And ultimately more important than having especially a strong central government, which he did fear to a significant extent. And today, Jefferson is still somebody who's sort of an icon to people who believe in states' rights, et cetera, especially, I would say, in general, a more conservative political outlook, though that's not always the case, but I think it often is. Ultimately, Jefferson did support the Constitution, but somewhat reluctantly. And that's why the person who put the slide together decided not to put Thomas Jefferson on here. Again, he provides some arguments the Anti-Federalists use, but at the same time, he does end up supporting the Constitution. One of the things that Anti-Federalists were also worried about, which is sort of interesting, I mentioned Washington being on the Federalist side. And I believe I mentioned this during the Locke lecture that I did, or one of them. They were really concerned about this peaceful transition of power issue when we move from Washington and to the next president, whom we know is Adams. This was a really big question. There were some people who believed that Washington would try and begin a new sort of dynastic government flowing out of, from Washington, and would refuse a peaceful transition of power and democratic elections. And again, that might seem sort of crazy that somebody would do that this early in the development of the country, when they were, this group of classical liberals who were all against what was going on in old Europe and against the monarchy and the aristocracy and all of the corruption, the centralization of power they identify that with. But again, some of these people were really worried that that would start happening again, that would happen in this country. In particular, maybe because Washington was on the Federalist side, Washington did have to struggle as the leader of the Continental Army to hold the colonies together, and obviously articulated his arguments for a strong central government. So it's interesting that, again, that was a concern back in the day with the first transition from the first president to the second president. And remember, too, there had never been elections before, for a new president. They had to figure out exactly how those elections were going to take place. And as we know from the most recent election and some of the controversy it created, there are different laws because, again, the Constitution gives a lot of this to the states and local governments to run their own elections, that there are different laws in states and local areas, right? Whether or not you can do mail-in ballots, right? Whether or not you can accept ballots as long as they're mailed by the end of the day on election night, or whether they have to arrive by then. All of the stuff that we've seen, being manipulated and arguments over in terms of this recent election, because obviously, if you want to disenfranchise people, you make it more difficult for their votes to count, right? They have to travel farther to actually count their votes, to actually cast their votes. You disallow mail-in votes, or you say that mail-in votes have to arrive by a certain time to be counted. Maybe you do things to try and slow up the post office, so it's less likely that people's votes will arrive in time. All these kinds of things that create these huge controversies. And I think, what was it, almost 60 lawsuits brought by Trump and the Trump administration against the different states and localities for how they ran their elections. You also saw the states and localities leading up to the elections, sometimes based on what political branch the secretaries of states and the local leadership and their senates and things represented, trying to make laws to make it either easier or harder for people to vote, et cetera, right? And none of this had been established at the time. So you can imagine, with all the controversy we just had recently, imagine the controversy that could have been created, and in some cases did exist, with the initial transition and initial election when we moved from Washington to Adams. Along with that, the campaign for presidency between Adams and Jefferson, and we know Jefferson ultimately ended up losing to Adams and being president after Adams, but that first campaign was very heated. It was even by modern standards, it was fairly ugly in terms of the language the candidates used against each other, the mudslinging. Again, there were no parameters here. There was no standard. There was no sense of tradition. There was no, much less any laws about how to undertake this kind of thing, and these campaigns and how they'd be financed and everything else, in terms of how the people would conduct themselves, right? There were no traditions and ideas about that yet. So it was a very ugly kind of campaign. Interestingly, after they retired, Jefferson and Adams went from being enemies, great enemies, in part because Jefferson, again, was still really pushing for states' rights and, had that kind of position of idealizing the yeoman farmer and believing the yeoman farmer was the ideal democratic citizen. And Adams, you had representing more people who were more highly educated and moneyed interests and trade and foreign policy and those kind of things. They actually came to respect one another a great deal later in their lives, because they realized they were both wanting what was best for the nation. They just had different beliefs about what was best for the country. And they started corresponding very regularly. And their correspondence is probably along with some of the correspondence in the debates between, the Adams-Douglas, the Lincoln-Douglas. There's some other famous correspondence in this country, but probably the most famous correspondence is that between Adams and Jefferson, after they had sort of retired from public life and really came to, again, appreciate and respect one another, became great friends. And in fact, interestingly, they both died on July 4th, 1826. And Jefferson ended up dying just a few hours before Adams, as far as we can tell. Adams, as he felt, he could tell he was about to pass away, thought that Jefferson was going to outlive him. They were still a little bit competitive as far as that goes, at least being able to be humorous about, how competitive they were, not knowing that Jefferson actually died a few hours before, because of course they couldn't call up on the phone and say Jefferson has just passed away. But it is appropriate, you might say, poetically appropriate, that that they died on the same day, July 4th, 1826, and that they became great friends. And again, their correspondence is really wonderful to read. One more or two more issues to mention, and then we'll move on to the Frederick Douglass piece. Madison on the side of the Federalists. One of his main concerns was what he called factions, and we kind of know what a faction is. It's kind of a new term in his day. A group of people, either in the minority or in the majority, that really try and rule by themselves and try to take too much power for themselves. And that was something that Madison was really worried about, needing to have a constitution that provided safeguards against that kind of thing happening. And we do know that we ended up with separation of powers and other kinds of things that new things added to the Bill of Rights over time, to the amendments to the Constitution over time, the Bill of Rights that was added to the original Constitution that was argued for by the Anti-Federalists, and sort of other kinds of things. You might think about this as sort of single party politics. People, because they have very strong beliefs, maybe tied to their religious beliefs, for example, who band together because they have the same religious beliefs and want to basically control the political scene, right? For people of their own kind, as it were, right? And it can be other kinds of groups as well. I think religion is probably one of the main concerns, which is why I mentioned that. That was something that Madison was concerned with. The other issue that you probably know that was famous that came out of all this was questions about the Electoral College and having an Electoral College, right? That was really a compromise between having the president elected by Congress and having the president elected by the popular vote. And Alexander Hamilton, the Federalist, is most identified with the Electoral College, which, as we know, was a sort of a compromise perspective. We know today you can still win the popular vote and still lose the presidency because of the Electoral College, which kind of functions another level up from, the individual voter. It's another way in which we have a Republican form of government. We don't have direct democracy. You vote for representatives, and those representatives include people in the Electoral College. And again, there are different questions about whether or not the Electoral College representatives have to certify the vote, can vote for somebody else. It has happened now and again, which is why that same dynamic was really pressed by the Trump administration, the most recent election. But it has been very controversial. There are many people that want to get rid of it, right? Want to have the elections decided just by the popular vote, believe that it is undemocratic to have an electoral college where you could have a president elected, as we have several recent Republican presidents who did not receive the popular vote majority. On the other hand, are people who want to argue that they don't think states with larger populations should be able to dominate the political scene. That just because you have a lower population does not mean you're less important politically or don't deserve the same rights or shouldn't have the same kind of voice when it comes to national politics. So again, those arguments still exist on both sides. You can see how one party thinks it would be an advantage to get rid of the Electoral College. The other wants to maintain it, or at least maybe change how it functions, but finds that it's a benefit, to them, given their political orientation, given the size of their party, the makeup of their party, the background of the people being more conservative and more liberal. Okay, I'm going to talk now about the Frederick Douglass speech. Again, it was called his 5th of July speech, even though it was given on the 4th of July. And I sort of apologize that the slide that I got here is unfortunately relatively small. It might be too hard for you to see, but I'll read over it. So this was called the 5th of July speech. It was given on the 4th of July. And this was 1852. Remember that Emancipation Proclamation was 1863 during the Civil War, right? Coming through Abraham Lincoln And the 13th Amendment then, which obviously finally outlawed slavery, is 1865 after the Civil War. Douglass was invited to give this speech. And I think, again, I've talked about this once previously, by, in this particular case, the Ladies of Rochester Anti-Slavery Sewing Society. And we know that Frederick Douglass did spend a portion of his life in the Rochester area. And as I think I talked about before, these sewing societies were the only opportunity that women really had to talk about politics and to debate politics, etc., because their husbands wouldn't do it with them to a large extent because they thought it wasn't something that was appropriate for women. The women didn't have the education, didn't have the minds for it. Certainly, they couldn't be elected to office. They didn't have the right to vote. They were basically, the home was their terrain, what's called the private sphere of society. But they did take advantage of the fact that when the men were out doing their work in the public sphere, that they could get together and have these sewing societies where they would discuss all of these important issues. And they did so. And a lot of organizing, both for the women who were involved in the abolitionist movement and the women involved in the suffrage movement, did a lot of their organizing and a lot of their work through these sewing societies. And this is just one example. It's maybe the best example, but it's just one of the examples of these organizations and how they functioned. So what the slide says is it mentions that Frederick Douglass is a runaway slave, self-educated. The term for that is autodidact. Doesn't mean somebody that works on cars. Autodidact means auto, self, didact, educated. We know that he was an author. His writings about his life growing up as a slave and what he experienced and learning to read and all these things is very powerful. Notable speaker, of course, world traveler. He did travel, especially to Western, in Western Europe to talk about the abolitionist movement, to be involved in discussions with abolitionist groups in England. Again, during the Civil War, the South did want England to come in on its side because it sent all these raw materials, cotton, wool, tobacco, to England. Major trade, lots of money, a big part of the economy. And so they thought they could get England to come in on its side. One of the reasons England did refuse to do this was because there was slavery that was still practiced in the Confederacy. But again, you can see how those linkages with Western Europe and England in particular were really important still. And also, I would say with France to a significant extent. He was a human rights advocate, was an advocate not just for abolitionism, but also for women's rights. He did appear at the Seneca Falls Declaration, the first women's rights convention in 1848, and did speak on behalf of the women's right to vote. He was a consultant with presidents. He was very highly respected. And then there's a quote here: "Right is of no sex, truth is of no color." That was a kind of line that he used both in his speeches on behalf of abolitionism and his speeches on behalf of women's suffrage. And in a second here, I'll get into why that was the case, why that kind of argument, those kinds of points of argument, right is of no sex, truth is of no color, were so important. So in this speech, first of all, he says, the 4th of July is the worst day possible for Black people. It throws in their face the fact that they did not have the same rights that everybody else has, or at least the white males have, right? They obviously didn't have the right to vote. Many of them were still slaves, right? This is 1852. So I think this is why he decides to title his talk the 5th of July speech rather than the 4th of July speech, because the 4th of July is just a very hateful time, as you can imagine, for African Americans. And that's both free Blacks in the North who still experienced a lot of discrimination and didn't have voting rights, at least the vast majority of them. and obviously for blacks in the South as well, who are still under the thumb of slavery. Um, he argues that he's not going to make an argument about the evils of slavery. He thinks that it's obvious. He says that people that support slavery, at least many of them, know it's an evil, and he can in fact go back to the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the First and Second Continental Congress, the debates around the Declaration, the debates about the Constitution, to show that these founders did know that slavery was evil, and eventually there was going to be a price to pay. He appealed to the Bible, a lot of biblical references that would have been very powerful for people. And we know were certainly also very powerful for African Americans. It was one of the a main form of the impetus to try and learn how to read was to read the Bible. That was the way to be saved, right? And to have a possibility at a better afterlife than the life you experienced here on earth, certainly as a slave, right? And it was also, in general, a motivation for people and white and black, or different backgrounds, to learn how to read was to read the Bible, because as we know, many of the religious denominations in this country, especially early on, the Bible was an incredibly important text to them. And then especially over time, even though the New Testament is oriented differently to the different religions, the Old Testament is still very important. So he makes these biblical references. He points out the idea that natural rights apply equally to black people as they do to white people. He draws on Enlightenment figures like John Locke. You'll see the language of John Locke being used there. He, in fact, says that slavery is an evil because the slave's body is his own. It belongs to him to control. Just the same kind of argument that John Locke gave against slavery in his second treatise on government. So you can see how he's going to use these enlightened arguments to point out that this classical liberal philosophy, political philosophy, under which the nation was founded, is not being followed the way it should be. That it's being used selectively just for a certain group of people, and that's white males largely. But that if we're going to talk in universal terms about people and people's rights and God-given rights, and you talk about God-given rights and you think about the Bible and you think about the issues of equality, and certainly some people have used the Bible to argue for the legitimacy of slavery, and slavery does still exist. You see a lot of it in the Old Testament. Many people would also use it and things in the Bible to argue against slavery and use biblical references about rights and about God and that sort of thing that are also consistent with what these enlightened figures were saying. Even though they tended to be deists as well, they still did believe, again, in a higher being who was a righteous, tolerant God who would not create one group of people to be inferior to another or one group of people to live under the thumb of another, etc. The main argument historically that has been used to oppress people, black and brown people, certainly in this country, and also women, Native Americans, is to use a form of argument or a way of defining what it means to be fully human that's based on white males. A lot of it people trace back to Aristotle and his writings about sort of human nature, about ethics, about what it means to be an ethical, responsible person, the kind of mind and intellect you have to have, etc. And the way in which what it meant to be a full human being, fully realized human being, to be rational and capable of deciding how to run your own life, to be able to take care of yourself, to be a part of government, to serve as a representative, etc., was all defined in a way that excluded people other than white males, right? Sometimes intentionally, sometimes not intentionally, but more so either naively or just saying, hey, this is tradition, that's how we do things. It's not because of racism or sexism, etc. So what you will see these groups doing who are fighting for the emancipation and freedom of people who are oppressed and again, I'm thinking of, again, Black and brown people, Native Americans, women, is to try and point out that they are in fact fully human. That they have the same capacities, the same abilities, the same intellect, and what Douglas says in the speech is moral, and that Black people, like women, are still moral, intellectual, and responsible beings. And if they have those assets, they need to have the same rights that everybody else has. You notice Harriet Martineau says the same thing in her piece about women's rights, that there are only certain groups who shouldn't have the right to determine their own lives, and that's because they're not capable, some kind of mental infirmity, or because they're children and they need to have adults taking care of them, etc. But that everybody else has the ability to be autonomous, to live their own life, to be a full citizen, to vote, to be a part of government, etc. And so what they had to do was to try and argue for and point out where these oppressed people had the same capacities as essentially white males do. And so that was largely the argument that they sort of made. To make that argument, they were basically working within the same Enlightenment framework. Instead of trying to change what it meant to be a full human, this is really important. So instead of change what it meant to be a full human being that comes through Aristotle and was inherited eventually in the Enlightenment, is not changed, but it's argued that women in these other groups are equal to that same definition, the same set of characteristics that define a full human being, that again come from people like Aristotle and Plato and up through into other sort of cultures and intellectual traditions up into the Enlightenment, that they're not going to question and challenge that idea of what it means to be a full human being. They're going to show that these oppressed groups are equal to that definition, that women, African Americans, etc., have the same capacities that Enlightenment folks claim one essentially needs to have to be a full human being. The reason I bring this up is that as we move through the course, we will see people starting to challenge that notion of what it means to be a full human being that comes, again, that's kind of thousands of years old. And to point out how limited that is, because that has limited us in how we understand what it means to be a male and what it means to be a female in ways that have both ultimately been injurious to both males and females. Right? That when you're a male, you shouldn't be emotional. You shouldn't take up certain kinds of jobs, a domestic job, being a nurse, being an elementary school teacher. And as a woman, you're kept out of the public sphere, except for maybe being a domestic in somebody else's home or being a teacher, or secretary, that you don't have the equal intellectual capacity that males do. You're more emotional, less logical and rational, etc. And so that whole idea, how those things were interpreted, that flows through the Enlightenment, starts to be questioned and challenged. Ultimately for the benefit of both males and females, I think you would say. And we'll see that as we get into some of the later writing, things that we'll read over the course of the semester. When we read Mary Wollstonecraft here soon, we'll see that she's using that same Enlightenment idea that she's trying to show that women measure up to. She's not yet far enough along historically to start to challenge that view of what it means to be a full human being. We'll see that coming along a little later. So that is so that's Frederick Douglass. Next here, I'll talk a little bit about Martineau. In some ways, she's actually better known in Europe than she's known in this country. As it says here, an important figure for several reasons, a prominent female scholar in an era where she was very much the exception. You had a very difficult time, especially acquiring higher education. in particular in this country, which is why some of these people either went to Europe to get their college educations. And I mentioned, certain women who had done that in the past. You had to be self-educated, or women who were from some of these countries, like Germany, for example, were able to acquire higher education earlier and more easily than people were in this country. So it's sort of interesting. We think of ourselves as being historically in the vanguard when it comes to women's rights, and that's not always been the case. There are, again, instances of women who could not get higher education in this country who did so in Europe. Brought sociology from France and Germany to England, where she translated Comte's work. Comte was sort of an early sociologist / philosopher. As it says here, among her contributions was the idea that sociologists might not only study important institutions in the public sphere, the economy, religion, politics, but must also look to the private sphere and examine families, children, and the lives of women. Where you will see her work taken up by later people, and women in particular, is somebody like Jane Addams in Chicago, who, as I may have also mentioned in the past in one of my lectures, had the second settlement house in this country, which was a place to help new immigrants to sort of assimilate to their new country, the new city they were living in, to figure out how to make their way, to acquire the degree of English they needed to kind of survive, how the government works, how to fend for themselves. Also a place where they could also meet up with and share with people who were from the same background. Hull House had education programs, it had arts programs, it had a theater, it had a swimming pool. It was actually a huge mansion that was rented to Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr, who worked with her to found Hull House. Eventually, they were able to acquire it, I think, it was either given to them or they were able to buy it very cheaply when it becomes so famous and so important in Chicago. And she was doing a lot of the same work that Martineau had done in looking at the health and well-being of these families in Chicago who were dealing with horrible living conditions, great poverty, really poor air because of all the coal that was being burned. And they were living in places in the city where there were industries that were burning lots of coal, where the air was just horrible. If you're wealthier, you were living closer by the lake. You were living farther away from the industrial era where the big meat packing plants were and those kind of things, the railroads. Clean water was a problem. Sewage, getting rid of trash. And Jane Addams went around and actually was sort of a sociologist. Many people was the first great American sociologist because she actually collected data about these things and went to local government officials in Chicago and actually was able to bring about some change to make life better for these families. And so you can see how she was building on the work of somebody like Harriet Martineau, and looking out for these families and their children, things like workplace conditions also for these families and children, etc. So as you can see, a strong proponent of women's rights and the emancipation of slaves for Martineau. Again, many of these women worked for both causes. So the political non-existence of women was taken from a piece called Society in America from 1837. So it was 11 years before the Seneca Falls Convention. And referring again to the convention, there's some interesting symmetry there. We have 1776, which is the Declaration of Independence, and supposedly the Declaration of the Rights of All People, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we have 72 years until the Seneca Falls Convention, until the women at the Seneca Falls Convention rewrite the Declaration into the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, pointing out that those rights and freedoms have not been applied to all people. The real formal beginning of the women's movement. Then we have another 72 years until 1920 when women finally acquire suffrage. And obviously the vast majority of the women, especially the ones who are really on the ground floor of the women's rights movement didn't live long enough to be able to vote, right? Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, etc., were crucial in that movement, but did not live long enough to actually see that vote. So again, 1776 Declaration, 72 years to the Seneca Falls, and its own declaration, Women's Rights Declaration, 1848, 72 years to suffrage in 1920, suffrage for women. Again, Martineau is going to make an argument here similar to what Douglas makes, and using the same Enlightenment figures and their discussions of rights and freedoms, and especially in terms of political rights and being viewed as a full human being. Not again questioning the idea of the full human being that comes out of the Enlightenment, but saying that women measure up to that. She pointed out how the social contract doesn't really exist for women, that they can't really leave relationships practically. Sometimes it was impossible to get out of marriages, or when you did, you lost everything: your children, your clothing, everything you brought to the marriage went to your husband. How were you going to fend for yourself if you weren't provided with education, etc.? And really, you couldn't leave the nation very easily either, for some of the same reasons. So even though Martineau points out this social contract idea kind of works for men, certainly it doesn't really work for women. Another thing she really criticizes here is how paternalistic men are towards women, and arguing that they should be grateful that they don't have to worry about politics and the political sphere and the world of jobs and careers and the hard work the men had to do, the responsibility to bring home food and money for the family and all these kind of things, that they should be grateful about that, and find that very paternalistic, right? And paternalism, right, that comes from Latin, the word pater, meaning father. So being treated like a father would treat his children. And another argument that was made that she challenged was this idea that women's interests would be subsumed by the interests of their husbands or fathers. So, for example, they didn't need the right to vote because their vote would be the same vote of their husbands and their fathers. We know that that was not the case. We see today in particular, and my guess is that over time, this phenomenon is happening more and more, where wives might vote differently than their husbands voted. We know, for example, in this most recent election, and I think in other recent elections, women, especially African-American women, have tended to vote more liberal than men, and been major supporters of the cause of the Democratic Party, for example. Harriet Martineau also points out, that they had to create laws to keep husbands from abusing physically and psychologically their wives. So if their husbands had their best interest out for their wives and could sort of be their proxy vote, why was it that they had to create laws to protect women from their husbands, right? And to a certain extent as well, sort of from their fathers. So again, there's definitely some hypocrisy there. She also mentions women's health issues near the latter part of the reading. And this is something I'll talk more about again in the future. She talks about psychological maladies, sometimes physical maladies that women suffered from. You started to see this most among middle-class women, and especially women who were interested in developing their minds. And middle and upper-class women could afford to do this because they had people to take care of their children, people to do the laundry, people to cook the dinners, right? If you're relatively well off. And these women didn't just want to sit around and sew and dance. They wanted to, and they had time to expand their minds. Maybe they would, maybe if they have a young woman would read her brother's texts from his college that he went to, or start a discussion group or something like that. And a lot of these women did suffer from these kinds of maladies. Sometimes they were overstated, but sometimes they were really real. Fainting spells and and headaches and depression, other kinds of things. And it was argued that that's because these women were trying to use their minds and that they shouldn't be. And these maladies just prove, of course, it was male doctors who were saying these things, that women should just be happy to work in the home and do their job and not try to really develop their minds, because their brains can't handle it. Their minds can't handle it. And so that was sort of the dominant argument, again, from men at the time. We'll talk more about. So the change in the perspective on these maladies over time, again, many of these things were true and really did exist, but the new explanation was that these women were trying to do these things on their own without being supported by society, sometimes doing them on the sly, sometimes under great duress, under criticism. You're trying to swim up a stream all the time, right? Like the salmon trying to spawn, right? Trying to climb waterfalls. And that it was that lack of support and appreciation from wanting to go to college and not being able to. Again, wanting to develop your mind, wanting to read, to write, about the things that you read, maybe to get involved in politics, to be an intellectual in some sense, without having any support from society and actually having a lot of pushback. That's what caused, and ultimately, these illnesses these women were experiencing. It was a lack of support from society that caused these maladies, not them trying to exercise their brains in ways that they weren't capable and shouldn't be doing. So I'll return to that. A really good example that I usually talk about in class when I talk about this piece, and when I talk about Martineau, was Alice James, who was the sister of William and Henry James, the novelist and philosopher, who was extremely bright. Some people think probably brighter than her two brothers. Died young. She really wanted to develop her mind. Her brothers would actually send her copies of their manuscripts to read before they sent them out for publication. They wanted her opinion. She started a correspondence course for women to help them, read literature and philosophy and political science. And so she was involved as a teacher, helping to teach these other women, etc. But she died young and had to deal with a lot of things like depression. I think probably eating disorders, other kinds of things that she suffered from being a part of this famous family. Henry James Sr. was also famous, a public figure. He was a religious figure. He was a mystic. He wrote on a religion called Swedenborgianism. And that Swedenborgianism was a kind of a mystical religion. And then he had his two sons, William and Henry James, a novelist and philosopher, psychologist, and they were famous, all this kind of stuff. And she's left out here, right? And so her diary is fascinating reading. And she talks about the work that her brothers do and did. And you can see that she has at least an equal mind to them. Okay, lastly here, the Iroquois Confederation Constitution, a really interesting document. I have two maps here that kind of show the area. I think this one probably would be the better, of the Iroquois Confederacy and the different nations of the Confederacy. There were 5 originally, and then eventually 6 when I think it was the Tuscarora that joined. They weren't from the area. They moved to the area to be safer. They had been involved in all kinds of wars and things, and so they moved in the direction of the Confederacy. You can see how a lot of it is directly in the area of upstate New York, where Geneseo is located. Again, that might be particularly interesting for those of you who are international students to see that this confederation of nations, of Native Americans, called the Iroquois Confederacy, is right from this particular area. And the line of the white line shows the borders between Canada and the United States, between the Canadian provinces and the United States. So you can maybe recognize the shape of there. So those were the 5 nations: the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and the Seneca. Seneca being, I believe, closest to this area. Those of you from the area know that there are reservations that are in the general area, and certainly in New York State, that there are lots of landmarks, that the names of lakes and mountains and other things have names from the language group of the Seneca and of the Iroquois. And the fascinating thing about the Iroquois Constitution is that it seems to parallel in ways the US Constitution. Now, there's lots of controversy about this. I have one other map I'll pop up here just for a second, or just as a final thing to share with you. That also shows sort of the outline of where this, and this basically has just the 5 nations too. It doesn't include the Tuscarora, but you see there, again, the Seneca, Cayuga, Mohawk, Oneida, and Onondaga. This is Conesus Lake right here, the lake that's very close to the college, right? And this is the area of the Seneca. And some people might also know Mount Morris area and Letchworth State Park is right around here. There are a lot of Seneca landmarks. Mary Jemison, who might be interested in reading about. It was a European who ended up living with the Native Americans. And these are the other of the lakes that are called the Finger Lakes. Again, especially those of you who are international students might find this interesting. And you can see that these lakes kind of look like the fingers on a hand. If you kind of picture that the wrist of the hand here and the hand being pointed down, that these almost look like fingers. Yeah, maybe broken and contorted, but nonetheless look like fingers. These are the lakes that we call the Finger Lakes, the westernmost of which is Lake Canisius, the one that's closest to here to Geneseo, to the college. So that's why this area is called the Finger Lakes area. These lakes were carved out by glaciers. As the glaciers made their way south and then receded, they gouged out the land and caused these long, thin lakes, because they're areas where the land was softer, wasn't as hard, was more porous, and it was easier for the glaciers to kind of dig out those areas, which is why these lakes look like sort of long fingers. So you can see this is New York State, Pennsylvania right below it. Here's the lake, Rochester up here, etc. So you can see how large this area was, right, of this Iroquois Confederacy. So this guy named Charles Mee, I believe his last name is spelled M-E-E, Charles Mee, in 1987 argued that there was a direct influence of this Iroquois Confederacy Constitution on the US Constitution through a guy named John Rutledge, who was from South Carolina and was involved in developing the Constitution. And since that time, many people have researched this and have not been able to find any kind of hard evidence that this was indeed the case, and are not aware of where Charles Mee got his supposedly hard evidence from of this. Today, I would say most people would argue that there was no kind of direct influence, and very probably not the case that John Rutledge wanted to model the U.S. Declaration, a Constitution after the Iroquois Confederacy Constitution, and that's why you see parallels between the two, that there are other potential reasons for that. But it's an interesting debate, discussion. It's kind of fun to think about. There were certainly kinds of what we would call loosely democratic practices of the Iroquois Confederation that are interesting. The authenticity of the Iroquois Constitution is in question. We know that a lot of these people were oral people traditionally, right? That they didn't write things down. When was the Constitution put in written down? When was it translated into English, if that was ever involved? How many hands did it pass through over time? Was it edited at any one point to maybe look more like the U.S. Constitution? I mean, all kinds of things that we're not sure of historically. that, again, some people have investigated. However, it's definitely possible, and maybe probable, that maybe at least in some kind of subconscious or very secondary ways, there could have been some kind of indirect influence, if not on the Iroquois Constitution itself, maybe at least of the Iroquois Confederacy on democratic practices as they developed in this country and the Constitution, etc. The reason I say that is because there were people who are among the founders who were very respectful of and interested in Native American culture. The two names that come most quickly to mind are Thomas Jefferson, whose father was very respectful of Native American culture, and Ben Franklin, who was also a friend to some of the Native American peoples living in the area, living in Pennsylvania and New York. And they were both definitely important voices, right, in the Continental Congress, etc., and the development of the Declaration, and as we move into the Constitution. And it could well be that some of the arguing points that they made did show the influence, direct or indirect, conscious or subconscious, on Native Americans who had lived in the area. I mean, it's certainly possible that that's the case. There is actually a guy named Scott Pratt, who's a philosopher. I think he's at the University of Oregon, who wrote a book called Native Pragmatism, in which he argues that the most important school of philosophy that developed out of this country, called pragmatism, and William James, who I mentioned earlier, is the brother of Alice James, is one of the founders of that movement, that movement can be traced back through Ben Franklin, and in fact, back to Native Americans living in New England. And that's kind of interesting to think about. So if you think about, the great school of philosophy coming out of, North America being pragmatism and that being influenced potentially by Native Americans, you think about maybe the greatest cultural achievement that this country has bequeathed to the rest of the world being blues and jazz music coming from African Americans. Is sort of interesting to think in the way in which, all that was kind of filtered through European Americans, but actually maybe came, if you trace it back far enough, from other peoples. So some of the things that you might have seen in looking through the Confederacy Constitution that look to be similar, there's a separation of powers. They talk about making amendments to their Constitution. They talk about added to the rafters if there's a new amendment that's made. They talk about what we call today as a quorum that we use in what's called Robert's Rules of Order, that a lot of political bodies, organizations use for their procedures. Our College Senate uses it. A quorum means you have to have a certain percentage of people present to vote on anything, right? You don't want to vote on things when people who will be impacted by the decisions you're making can't be there to offer their arguments and to be able to have a voice in the vote for that. They talk about pine tree chiefs, who are sort of like a president's cabinet or a brain trust, who will specialize in certain areas. And so that, you can refer to those people. Most importantly, this is a confederacy. It's the third context I've used that word in this lecture, right? I talked about the Articles of Confederacy first, which came before the Declaration, before the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution. I talked about the Confederacy in the South, right? A loose federation, right, of states. And here we have Confederacy again. And that is because, in fact, the Iroquois Confederacy was just that. These nations would work together. They would draw strength from each other, right? These 5 and eventually 6. And so they had the benefits of strength to fight off adversaries, to deal with maybe issues of, food, when food is scarce, to be able to, share with each other, to have the benefits of working together. But it was still a confederacy. They still had the right to practice their own rights and festivals. Under certain conditions, they could still leave the confederacy, though you couldn't just willy-nilly drop out and say, okay, we're leaving. because that would impact the group, right? It's the reason that of the two arguments given in the North for why to fight against the South, one was the eventual argument was slavery. The initial argument that was more politically palatable to a lot of people was to hold the Union together. People can't just decide to leave because that impacts the whole, right? And same is true with this Iroquois Confederacy. You can't just leave without having a good reason. Ultimately, you could do it, but you had to have good reason. So you kind of had something like states' rights in terms of the rights that the different nations had, Seneca, Cayuga, Mohawk, Oneida, and Onondaga. But you had the benefits of being a whole and working together and benefiting from the strengths that a larger group can provide you when it comes to survival, etc. So again, it's a very interesting document. Does show interesting parallels to our own Constitution. My guess is that those things probably, again, did not directly influence our own Constitution. Evidence seems to suggest not, or at least evidence doesn't seem to exist to suggest that there was a direct impact. But again, there could have been an indirect impact in certain kinds of ways of at least certain ideas about what we would call politics with the way the Iroquois Confederacy functioned and our own political orientation in this country, though it clearly grows most clearly out of the Enlightenment and out of Enlightenment figures in Europe and in England and France in particular. Okay, I know this was a lengthy lecture. I hope you found it helpful. I'll be back shortly with my lecture on Wollstonecraft. So as always email me if you have any questions, and I will get back to you real quickly about those questions. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the week, and I'll talk to you again soon.